He thought he had buried the past when he threw her out of their home 6 years ago, convinced by lies and blinded by pride. She disappeared without a trace. No goodbyes, no explanations. But today, as he stands at the altar beside another woman, the past returns, not alone, but with 2 children who carry his eyes and a truth powerful enough to unravel everything he thought he knew. This is the beginning of a story about betrayal, redemption, and the weight of choices we can't take back. Tell us in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? This is another unforgettable tale from Mr. Edward's Tales, where you truly feel the emotion of stories that make you reflect on life. The sun-drenched hills of Valmora were in full bloom, the vineyard rose casting long shadows across the estate as the Blake family prepared to host what was touted as the wedding of the decade. 300 elegantly dressed guests sat beneath gauzy white tents, fanning themselves gently while sipping chilled rosé, their conversations a murmur against the backdrop of a live quartet. At the altar stood Conrad Blake, tall and stoic in a custom-tailored navy tuxedo, his jaw tense, his eyes scanning the aisle where his soon-to-be bride, Delilah Crest, would soon appear. The air was thick with anticipation, yet unease clung to it, invisible and electric. Conrad's parents exchanged muted glances from the front row, sensing the stiffness in their son's posture. Only Nolan Crest, best man and brother to the bride, smiled with certainty, adjusting his cufflinks as though rehearsing for a photo. Then, just as the violins shifted into the opening notes of the bridal march, the impossible occurred. The distant but unmistakable whump-whump of helicopter blades sliced through the moment like a knife through silk. Heads turned skyward, confusion washing over the crowd like a wave. "Is this part of the ceremony?" someone whispered, but Conrad, now frozen, went pale. He knew that sound. The black helicopter descended onto the private helipad just beyond the vineyard, sending petals and napkins flying, its powerful downwash stirring panic and awe in equal measure. The quartet stopped playing. Waitstaff ducked instinctively. Delilah, who had just stepped onto the aisle in her custom white and gold Marchesa gown, faltered, blinking rapidly. "What is going on?" she hissed, glaring toward the altar. Conrad didn't answer. His eyes were locked on the aircraft's door as it opened with a hydraulic hiss. Out stepped a woman in a tailored navy suit, her rich auburn hair pinned back in a severe bun that only amplified the fierce precision in her gaze. She walked with the calm of someone who had prepared for this moment for years. Gasps rippled through the audience. Behind her, 2 children followed, a boy and a girl, no older than 6, impeccably dressed, each holding one of her hands. The murmurs grew louder as guests began to stand, craning their necks. "Is that?" someone near the front whispered. "Oh my God," a woman gasped. Conrad's mother clutched her husband's arm. "It's Maureen," she breathed. "And those children, they have Conrad's eyes." Even the minister stepped back, uncertain whether to continue. Delilah spun toward Conrad. "Who is that woman? Tell me right now." Maureen Sinclair did not pause, did not flinch beneath hundreds of scrutinizing eyes. She walked with steady, deliberate steps toward the altar, her children moving confidently beside her. It had been 6 years since she was last on this estate, 6 years since she had been thrown out in the dead of night, pregnant, humiliated, and cut off from every aspect of the life she helped build. She looked at Conrad, whose mouth was slightly ajar, his color drained. "Good afternoon," she said evenly, her voice slicing through the stunned silence. "I apologize for the disruption, but this couldn't wait another day." Murmurs erupted anew. Nolan Crest's face twisted in alarm, his eyes darting to his sister, then to the guests. "Security!" he called out, gesturing toward Maureen. But Maureen simply raised her hand. "I wouldn't, Nolan," she warned, "unless you'd like me to release the full records of your offshore accounts, the doctored trial data, and the timeline of your coordinated embezzlement, here and now, in front of your precious investors." A collective gasp rippled through the attendees, many of whom were board members, stakeholders, and international partners. Delilah's face turned a sickly shade of white. "What the hell is this?" she snapped, rounding on Nolan. "You said she was gone." Conrad opened his mouth, but no words came. He was staring at the children now, fixated. The little boy with his solemn gaze had his angular jawline. The girl, eyes wide and curious, had that same flicker of intense focus Conrad recognized from the mirror. "This isn't real," he whispered, more to himself than anyone else. But Maureen took a step forward and nodded at the children. "Conrad," she said softly, but with a firm edge. "These are your children, Leora and Cassian. They're 6. I tried to tell you once. Your head of security turned me away. You said you wanted a paternity test after the birth. No one ever followed up." Conrad's knees nearly gave out. He looked toward Nolan, whose face was a study in panic. "Is this true?" he asked, his voice hollow. Nolan cleared his throat. "She's manipulating you. This is all a stunt." "Don't," Maureen interrupted. "Don't insult your audience, Nolan. I have the DNA results. I have the court filings. I have the email trail, the one you thought you erased. And more importantly," she added, locking eyes with him, "I have nothing left to lose." The audience was no longer simply watching a ruined wedding. They were witnessing the unraveling of a dynasty. Executives and dignitaries who had flown in from London, New York, and Tokyo leaned forward, sensing that history was being made in real time. Some began recording discreetly. Maureen handed a small folder to the 4 officiant, who looked at it with trembling hands, then passed it to Conrad. He opened it slowly. Inside were copies of paternity test results, notarized documents, timelines, proof not just of the children's parentage, but of the elaborate scheme used to erase Maureen from his life. You were pregnant," Conrad whispered, his voice breaking. "I tried to tell you," Maureen said again, this time more quietly. "You didn't want to hear it." Delilah lunged forward, rage overtaking her. "You planned this. You're jealous. You waited 6 years to crash my wedding because you're still obsessed with him." But it was Nolan who grabbed her arm. "Enough," he muttered. "She's not bluffing." A shriek of disbelief left Delilah's throat. "You told me she'd never come back." "She wasn't supposed to," Nolan hissed through clenched teeth. "We paid enough to ensure that." The crowd's reaction was immediate. Shock, horror, disgust. Conrad looked physically ill. It was Dr. Helena Vaughan who emerged from the edge of the gathering, her presence calm and authoritative. "Ms. Sinclair is not alone in her claims," she said, lifting a tablet in one hand. "I represent the independent research team that audited Sinclair Bio's last 3 cancer drug trials. We found clear evidence of data manipulation, specifically involving compounds authorized by Mr. Crest." She handed the tablet to one of the reporters who had been invited to cover the wedding for society columns. "You may want to check page 6, she added. As murmurs turned into an uproar, security moved in, but not toward Maureen. 2 men in dark suits stepped forward, showing federal badges. "Nolan Crest, Delilah Crest," one said firmly. "You are under investigation for financial fraud, data tampering, and obstruction of justice. Please come with us." Nolan didn't move. "You have no jurisdiction," he sneered. "Actually," the agent replied, "we do. You're on U.S. soil, operating a company registered in 3 federal systems, and we have more than enough to detain you." As they were escorted out, Delilah screamed, "This isn't over!" Maureen turned to Conrad, who still clutched the folder. "It is for you," she said coolly. "But for our children, this is only the beginning." 6 years earlier, long before white roses rained down from the sky, and before Maureen Sinclair arrived in a helicopter to reclaim her voice, she and Conrad Blake had been the face of innovation, a golden couple celebrated in industry journals and global conferences. She was known for her revolutionary research in genomic medicine, a prodigy who turned down offers from Zurich, Boston, and Singapore to build something with integrity. Conrad, by contrast, was born into power, an heir to the vast Blake Sinclair pharmaceutical fortune, raised with manners and mandates, but burdened by the shadow of his late father's legacy. Together, they were fierce but tender, brilliant but balanced, and had built a partnership that many envied. Their townhouse in Palmera's old district was filled with laughter, coffee-fueled late-night data analysis, and dreams of starting a family once the cancer trials reached phase 3. But beneath that serenity, something had started to shift, subtle at first, almost imperceptible. It began with Conrad's childhood friend, Nolan Crest, rejoining Sinclair Biosolutions as chief financial officer, and bringing along his sister Delilah, a socialite with a degree in marketing and an uncanny gift for manipulation. They smiled often. They spoke softly. They studied Maureen like scientists examine prey. At first, Maureen had no reason to be suspicious. She welcomed Delilah with professional warmth and even shared lab updates with her during company events. Nolan, though distant, was still Conrad's closest friend since prep school and had been the best man at their wedding. The cracks came like whispers in a silent room. A joke here, a suggestion there. "She's always in the lab, isn't she?" Delilah mused at one dinner. "You must feel more married to the Beakers than the bride." Conrad had chuckled, dismissing the comment. But the seed was planted. Nolan, ever strategic, subtly fanned it, using his influence within Sinclair's board to question Maureen's commitment to the company's public image. "She's brilliant," Nolan would say, "but maybe she's too immersed. There's a difference between science and vision. Investors like optics, not equations." The tension built slowly, almost artfully, and Maureen, consumed by her work, didn't see the stage being set. One night, as she finalized data points on a groundbreaking immunotherapy formula, she felt Conrad's absence. He had stopped visiting the lab, stopped asking about the trials. Conversations became routine. Touches became rare. She chalked it up to stress, unaware that behind closed doors, a script was being written to cast her as the villain. The betrayal came not as a blow, but as a cascade. It began with the discovery of a watch in the drawer of Maureen's car, a men's luxury brand she had never seen before. Then came the texts. Explicit messages from an unknown number appeared on Conrad's private device, supposedly written by Maureen to someone named Julian. Messages dripping with intimate references and thinly veiled instructions for clandestine meetings. At first, Maureen laughed when Conrad confronted her, the absurdity so great she believed it would unravel with a conversation. "I don't even know a Julian," she said, genuinely confused, reaching for the phone. But Conrad yanked it away. "Don't insult me," he said, eyes wild. "These came from your number. These were sent when I was in Shanghai." Maureen, horrified, tried to explain. "Anyone could have spoofed a number. Please think logically." But logic had fled the room. Then Nolan arrived, uninvited, holding a small envelope. "Security found these in the glove compartment," he announced, handing over a hotel keycard and a pair of cufflinks monogrammed with initials that didn't belong to Conrad. "I've never seen those in my life," Maureen cried, her voice breaking, but Conrad stepped back as if her presence alone scorched him. "Get out," he whispered. "Now." Within the hour, her world disintegrated. Her access cards were deactivated, her email accounts locked. The joint accounts she once shared with Conrad were emptied, her name scrubbed clean from every database connected to Sinclair Biosolutions. The security guards, men she had once greeted by name, escorted her from the estate without ceremony, her belongings shoved into a suitcase she hadn't packed. Maureen stood in the rain, barefoot in silk pajamas, clutching her coat as the front gate closed behind her. "I'll prove it," she said to no one, trembling. "I'll prove I didn't do this." But there was no one left to hear her. That night she drove aimlessly until she pulled into a pharmacy parking lot, her heart beating against her ribs like a frightened animal. Nausea overwhelmed her. At first she assumed it, the shock. But then, with hands that refused to steady, she purchased a pregnancy test. 3 minutes later, in the sterile blue light of a public bathroom, she stared at the positive result. Her knees gave way. Her reflection in the mirror was unrecognizable. Not the acclaimed scientist, not the wife, not even the woman she'd been that morning. Just Maureen, just betrayed, just pregnant, alone. The days that followed were a masterclass in cruelty. Her phone rang with calls from journalists who had caught wind of the scandal. A brilliant scientist caught in a torrid affair. Colleagues stopped responding. Her name was quietly removed from her ongoing research trials. Grant foundations retracted pending support. Friends, or those she thought were friends, sent polite messages distancing themselves. The industry, once in awe of her intellect, had turned her into a cautionary tale. She tried, in vain, to reach Conrad again. "He doesn't want to see you," the assistant said coldly. "And frankly, I don't blame him." Maureen sent an email with the news of the pregnancy. The response came from the legal team. Given the alleged infidelity, Mr. Blake reserves the right to request a paternity test after the child's birth. That was the last contact. Left with nothing but a few personal savings, Maureen sold her wedding ring, a piece that had once been appraised at $500,000, for a fraction of its worth. It was enough for a few weeks of shelter, prenatal care, and a second-hand laptop. The betrayal haunted her every breath, but in the deepest, most broken corner of her soul, something else stirred, a determination not to be erased. And so, beneath the weight of shame and the ache of abandonment, Maureen did what only a mind like hers could do. She began to reconstruct. Alone in a tiny rented room above a bakery, she pored over every detail of what had happened. She charted timelines, cross-referenced dates, and began to notice discrepancies. The text messages had been sent during times she was in labs without signal. The hotel. Receipts bore timestamps that clashed with security badge logs, showing her location elsewhere. The cufflinks and keycard had never once touched her hand. She would have recognized the hotel name instantly, having worked on a case against them years prior for unethical pricing in rural cancer centers. It became clear this had been orchestrated, not just a moment of jealousy or an overreaction, but a calculated plot to remove her. Why? For what gain? As she stared at her growing belly in the mirror one night, her hands resting on the faint curve of life, the answer came to her like a whisper. Money, position, control. With Maureen gone, Sinclair Biosolutions would have no ethical voice in the boardroom. Nolan would have no one checking the clinical data. And Conrad had never been strong enough to question the people closest to him. The nights were the worst. Cold, dark, and endless. They wrapped Maureen in silence that felt heavier than the concrete parking lots she called shelter. For 14 days her car had become her only refuge, a rented compact with faulty heat and windows that squeaked when rolled. Parked behind a 24-hour grocery store, she spent her evenings curled on the passenger seat, wrapped in 2 sweaters and a coat too elegant for her current life. Her growing belly was just beginning to show, a subtle but constant reminder of the child, or children, developing within. Her days were spent wandering, eating dry crackers to keep the nausea at bay, and ducking into public libraries or cafes to charge her phone and comb job listings. She avoided mirrors. She avoided people. Most of all, she avoided her own thoughts. Shame was a companion she hadn't invited, but it followed her like a shadow, whispering things in the quiet. How could you have been so blind, so naive? Yet even in the pit of despair, her mind, trained in scientific rigor and logic, continued to search for explanations, patterns, anything to make sense of how her world had collapsed so completely and deliberately in just a matter of hours. It was on the 15th morning, as she crouched behind a dumpster vomiting bile, that Miriam Rose appeared. The woman stood in the morning mist, wearing a heavy gray cardigan over a floral nightgown, a steaming mug in her hand, and a stern look on her weathered face. "You're either pregnant or poisoned," she declared matter-of-factly, her voice sharp but not unkind. "Either way, you shouldn't be alone." Maureen, too sick and tired to protest, allowed herself to be ushered into the small brick house just behind the alley. Miriam's home smelled of lavender and old wood. Photographs lined the hallway, black and white portraits of a daughter long past, a husband gone too soon, and cats with names written in faded marker. Miriam was not chatty. She handed Maureen a towel, pointed to the bathroom, and set a plate of toast and boiled eggs on the kitchen table. "Stay a day, maybe 2, she said. "Then we'll talk." That day turned into a week. Maureen, initially wary, found herself swept into the quiet rhythms of the house, folding laundry, cooking simple meals, watching old crime dramas at night. She slept in a room once belonging to Miriam's daughter, with lace, curtains and a chipped bookshelf filled with classic novels, and slowly, her hands stopped trembling when she held a spoon. Slowly, she started to breathe again. On the 7th night, as rain tapped softly against the window and Miriam sipped brandy from a chipped glass, Maureen finally broke her silence. She told her everything, the affair she never had, the pregnancy, the watch and hotel keycard planted in her car, the coldness in Conrad's voice, the security guards that dragged her from the life she had helped build. Miriam didn't interrupt. She only listened, nodding occasionally, her fingers curled tightly around the glass. I buried my daughter because the doctors didn't catch her cancer in time, Miriam said when Maureen finished. That was 20 years ago. You know what they said? The data was inconclusive. Her case wasn't typical. I've hated those words ever since. Maureen stared at her, surprised. Miriam continued. You were betrayed, child. They removed you because you were in the way of something bigger. You feel it in your bones, don't you? And she did. Every time she thought about her research, about the direction those trials were heading before she was removed, something tugged at her memory. A note, an irregularity, a hesitation she'd felt reviewing test results just before Conrad left for Shanghai. They're covering something up, Maureen whispered aloud for the first time, and I almost uncovered it. The revelation struck like lightning. That night, Maureen sat on the edge of the twin bed, a notebook open on her lap, scribbling timelines and lab notes from memory. The dots connected slowly, but unmistakably. Certain adverse effects had appeared in early trial data, liver irregularities, hormonal imbalances, but those results had been dismissed as statistical anomalies. Maureen remembered pushing back, requesting expanded trials, only to be told the board was eager to accelerate approvals. Nolan had insisted it was all within protocol, and she had trusted him. Now she saw it clearly. She had been getting too close to the truth. Her demands for additional studies had threatened the fast-tracked deals Nolan had arranged behind closed doors. Her removal was not only personal, it was calculated. The realization filled her with fury, but also purpose. She began compiling what little evidence she could remember. Dates of ET, meetings, code names of compounds, trial identifiers, names of lab techs who had raised concerns. She made a list of people who might still believe in her. An intern named Carl, a researcher in Florida, a retired lab supervisor. It wasn't much, but it was something. And for the first time since her exile began, Maureen didn't feel like a victim. She felt like a scientist again. A week later, while sitting in a quiet coffee shop near the university district, Maureen overheard a conversation that would further ignite her mission. Two men in lab coats sat behind her, whispering over steaming cups of black coffee and a tablet. They altered the side effect profiles before submission, one muttered. The numbers don't line up, and Crest signed off on everything. The other replied, You think Blake even saw the raw data? Maureen froze, her heart hammering. She waited until they left, then scribbled everything she remembered. Her instincts had been right. Something rotten was festering within Sinclair Biosolutions. Lives were at risk. Patients could die, and Nolan Crest was at the center of it. That evening, she told Miriam everything. The old woman set down her knitting needles and looked Maureen square in the eye. Then you're not just a mother now, she said. You're a witness, and witnesses have responsibilities. Maureen's voice cracked as she replied, I don't have power, or money, or influence. Miriam stood up and handed her the phone. Then we find someone who does. But first, eat something. Revolution runs better on a full stomach. The old woman's blunt wisdom became a kind of balm. And just like that, Maureen knew she wasn't alone anymore. As the winter days shortened and her pregnancy became unmistakable, Maureen moved from hiding to planning. With Miriam's help, she opened a new bank account under her maiden name. She purchased a used laptop and began rebuilding her portfolio. Quietly, she reached out to a few trusted contacts, offering freelance analysis work under a pseudonym. It wasn't glamorous, but it kept her mind sharp and provided just enough for prenatal visits. She visited clinics under cash-based systems, always wary of leaving a paper trail that could be traced. Her belly grew, her resolve solidified. Every kick from within was a reminder. This wasn't just about revenge. This was about protecting lives, her own, her children's, and those who might unknowingly take a poison labeled as medicine. Late one night, as she stared out the window at the moonlit street, Miriam placed a hand on her shoulder. You're building something, she said. Something they won't see coming. Maureen didn't answer right away. She just looked at the stars and whispered, Let them think I vanished. Let them forget my name. When I return, I won't just have evidence. I'll have a cure they can't touch. And in that modest little house with its creaky floorboards and unmatched teacups, a quiet revolution was born. The first time Maureen met Dr. Helena Vaughn, she expected another closed door. She had applied under her maiden name, Maureen Vale, for a part-time research position at a community clinic in a neighboring town. The listing had been obscure, posted on a forum for academic refugees and independent medical researchers. What she hadn't expected was to walk into a cramped office and find a woman in her late 50s, silver hair braided down her back, hunched over patient files and surrounded by 3 different computers, buzzing with raw data. Helena didn't look up immediately. "You're late by 3 minutes," she said dryly. "But considering you're pregnant and probably walked here, I'll let it slide." Maureen blinked, taken aback. "How did you know I walked?" Helena finally looked up. Her eyes were sharp, scanning. "You smell like car exhaust, but your shoes are too clean. You were near traffic but didn't step through it." She leaned back. "Also, I read your paper on gene therapy modulation in glioblastoma clusters. Anyone who writes like that deserves a better fate than flipping files at some county lab." Maureen stared. "You read my work." Helena shrugged. "I collect misfits. Sit. Down. Let's talk about your brain." The hours that followed would mark the turning point of Maureen's exile. What began as a cautious interview shifted into an intense discussion about ethics in medicine, the corruption of pharma boards, and the quiet war between scientific truth and financial interest. Helena revealed that she had walked away from academia years ago after discovering that her hospital was suppressing data to maintain funding. "I could have stayed," she said bitterly, "played the game, smiled for the donors, but I was tired of watching people die while we padded quarterly. Reports." She motioned to a laminated photo on the wall. A young boy with a feeding tube, his smile too wide for someone so fragile. "My nephew died waiting for a drug we couldn't afford to fast-track because it wasn't profitable enough." Maureen understood that pain instantly. Their bond was sealed not through sympathy, but through shared fury. "I'm building something in secret," Helena confessed. "A lab, in a converted barn on my family's property, fully equipped, off the grid. I need someone to help me take it further." Maureen hesitated. "You don't even know me." Helena laughed. "You're right, but I know what the world did to you. That's enough for me. Let's make medicine the bastards can't control." The barn was not what Maureen expected. Set behind a grove of oak trees and shielded from the road by natural overgrowth, it looked like something out of a painting. Quaint, with chipped red paint and ivy creeping along the side. But inside, it was a fortress of innovation. Stainless steel counters lined the walls. Centrifuges, incubators, microscopes, and a cryogenic freezer stood like sentinels among shelves of labeled compounds and data binders. Helena flicked a switch, and the hum of machinery filled the air. "Everything in here was bought second-hand, refurbished, or smuggled out of university surplus auctions," she explained. "And I fund it through private investments, quiet ones, old friends, ex-patients. Some believe in what we're doing, others just hate Big Pharma." Maureen walked slowly, trailing her fingers across a pristine lab bench. "You built all this?" she whispered. "Alone?" Helena nodded. "It's not much compared to the Sinclair Towers, I'm sure. But here, no one censors your research. No one buries findings for the sake of market value. It's just science." Maureen's chest tightened with emotion. "I haven't touched equipment like this in months." Helena handed her a white coat. "Then stop mourning the past, Vale. It's time to resurrect your purpose." They worked like women possessed. Days blurred into nights, and the seasons began to shift around them. Helena handled patient data and ran administrative cover through the clinic. Maureen took the lead on development, using old notebooks and memory to reconstruct the treatment she had once been fine-tuning before her exile. But this time, she improved it, stripping out unstable compounds, replacing synthetics with bioequivalents, and testing multiple formulations in parallel. The goal was simple but ambitious: to create a cancer therapy with minimal side effects, accessible production, and open-source licensing to prevent future exploitation. They called it Project Azura. Each breakthrough was documented on a secure offline server, and Helena insisted they maintain hard copies. "Never trust a cloud with revolution," she said. Every time Maureen's body reminded her of her pregnancy, the swollen ankles, the acid reflux, the kicks against her ribs, she reminded herself that she wasn't just building a drug, she was building a future her children could be proud of. One night, she sat alone in the barn, cradling her belly and whispering, "You won't inherit a legacy of lies. I promise you." And for the first time since her exile, she believed she could keep that promise. When the formulation finally stabilized, and the test results began showing consistent tumor suppression in vitro, with nearly no cytotoxic response, Helena poured them both glasses of cheap red wine. "This is it," she said, holding up a vial like it was holy. "This changes everything." But Maureen was cautious. "We can't make it public yet. It needs peer validation. We need a safety trial, even if unofficial." Helena grinned. "Already on it. A retired oncologist I trust is reviewing our notes. But we also need to protect it, patent it, quietly, under your name." Maureen shook her head. "That will raise alarms. Nolan and Sinclair's lawyers will be watching for anything tied to me." Helena smirked. "That's why we use your real name, your forgotten one, Maureen Vale. It's clean, untraceable to them, and it honors the woman who survived hell." The company they formed was registered in a quiet district in Vermont under a shell parent called Nova Orchid Labs. It sounded elegant, harmless, even pretty, exactly the kind of name that slipped beneath radar. Maureen spent sleepless nights crafting the patent language, ensuring it was airtight, but vague enough to delay suspicion. With each step, they moved closer not just to healing patients, but to striking at the very core of the empire that tried to erase her. What neither of them knew yet was that their fledgling creation was already casting a shadow over Sinclair Biosolutions. Across the country, whispers began to rise in academic circles of a mysterious new formulation showing results no one else had achieved. Hospital administrators were quietly comparing trial outcomes, noting drops in readmission rates and improvements in immune markers. Nova Orchid began attracting attention from small research, clinics desperate for alternatives to expensive Sinclair contracts. But inside the towering walls of Sinclair Biosolutions, Nolan Crest and Conrad Blake were still oblivious. Nolan had become increasingly consumed by financial maneuvering, tightening control over research spending, and suppressing data that threatened stock performance. Conrad, now more figurehead than innovator, spent his time attending charity events with Delilah on his arm, unaware that his past was gathering storm clouds just beyond the horizon. And so the underground cure, born in a barn, fueled by betrayal and built by two women the world had written off, continued to grow. And Maureen, no longer a fallen wife or exiled scientist, was becoming something far more dangerous than either man could imagine. A force with nothing to lose and everything to prove. By the time the twins turned 2, Nova Orchid Labs was no longer a whispered name in backroom conversations. It had become a quiet disruptor, delivering real results in the oncology field with unprecedented efficiency and integrity. The treatment Maureen and Helena developed, known publicly as AZ7, Veil Protocol, had just passed its final FDA review. It wasn't announced with fanfare, no press releases or magazine covers, just a silent email with an approval notice attached, and a clinical registry entry that now bore the name Dr. Maureen Vale. Maureen stared at the screen in stunned disbelief, as Helena read the document aloud, eyes misting. "You did it," she whispered. "No," Maureen corrected, her voice trembling. "We did it." Their data had withstood every scrutiny. The formulation, manufacturing processes, independent third-party replication, all of it clean, all of it ethical. The result was a safe, effective cancer therapy with significantly reduced side effects and lower production costs, and it had been crafted from exile, with no investors, no shareholders, and no interference. That same week, Maureen held the twins, Leora and Cassian, close against her, letting them sleep. In her arms on the living room couch, finally allowing herself the dangerous luxury of hope. The news spread slowly at first, as breakthroughs often do when they're not sponsored by billion-dollar machines. But within a month, Nova Orchid began receiving inquiries from smaller hospitals and university clinics. By the third month, the Mercy Health Network, a national chain of non-profit hospitals, formally requested a contract. Their administrators had grown tired of the high costs and mounting complaints linked to Sinclair Biosolutions cancer treatments, which had begun reporting an increase in adverse liver reactions. The comparative results between Sinclair's old protocols and Nova Orchid's AZ7 were impossible to ignore. Helena coordinated the onboarding logistics, while Maureen handled clinical liaison and compliance, always under the name Maureen Veil. She rarely attended meetings in person, preferring to remain a step removed, but her voice, calm and firm, became recognizable to dozens of department heads who found themselves won over by her transparency. "Why haven't we heard of your company before?" one director asked during a video call. Maureen offered a small smile. "Because we weren't built for visibility. We were built for impact." Her voice had lost the tremble it once held. Silence had once been her prison, but now it had become her weapon. Quiet strength, quiet presence, quiet revolution. It wasn't long before Sinclair Biosolutions noticed the bleed. When two of their oldest client hospitals pulled out of multi-year contracts citing safer alternatives, Nolan Crest stormed into the executive wing in a fury. He barked at assistants, demanded dossiers on this Nova Orchid labs, and called for internal audits. Conrad, who had become increasingly detached from day-to-day operations, was pulled from a charity gala to attend a hastily scheduled board meeting. "How did we miss this?" he asked, frowning at the reports. "Who is behind Nova Orchid?" Nolan, already red in the face, slammed his hand on the table. "That's what I'm trying to find out. The founder's name is Maureen Veil. Doesn't ring a bell. Private entity. No press. No public interviews." Conrad stared at the name, something about it tugging at the edges of memory, but it slipped through like mist. Delilah, seated quietly in the corner, crossed her legs with practiced poise. "Should we consider acquisition?" she suggested. "If their product is outperforming ours, why not just buy them out?" Nolan's eyes gleamed. "That was my thought exactly. Let's make them an offer they can't refuse. Find out who their stakeholders are. Use proxies if we must." And so the machine that once destroyed Maureen began moving toward her again. This time, unknowingly. The offer came wrapped in gold. A polished email from a prestigious investment group requesting a confidential meeting to discuss a buyout. Helena was suspicious from the start. "These numbers are too perfect," she said, frowning at the proposal. "No negotiation, no questions. Just a clean buyout? That's not curiosity. That's extraction." Maureen scrolled through the message, her expression unreadable. "And the firm's registered in New York, but the lawyer's signature traces back to Crest Holdings." Helena's lips thinned. Nolan. They declined the meeting with professional courtesy, offering no explanation. A week later, another offer arrived, this time with pressure. "Failure to engage may result in competitive legal reassessment of your licensing claims." That's when Maureen decided to send a message of her own. She instructed her PR consultant to release a quiet announcement to select medical journals. Nova Orchid Labs, founded by Dr. Maureen Veil, secures long-term cancer treatment contract with Mercy Health Network. Results suggest improved efficacy and dramatically reduced toxicity rates. Within hours, her phone buzzed nonstop. Media outlets, research analysts, medical panels, everyone wanted a statement. Maureen offered none. "Let them wonder," she told Helena. "Let them circle the name. Eventually someone will figure it out, but by then, it'll be too late." And it was. The company name reached Conrad again, this time in a private dossier on his desk, paired with a photo of Maureen presenting clinical data to an independent review board. He froze. The photo was unmistakable. Her hair was shorter now, her figure more mature, her expression sharper. But it was her. The woman he had expelled. The woman he had never truly mourned because he had never truly understood what he'd lost. "This can't be right," he whispered. "Veil. Maureen Veil." Then it clicked. She hadn't just survived. She had rebuilt herself, reclaimed her science, and created something that was actively bleeding. His empire. "Why didn't you tell me?" he demanded of Nolan minutes later. "You said she disappeared." Nolan, caught off guard, stammered. She didn't use the Blake name. We had no idea she was behind Nova Orchid." Conrad's hands trembled. "And now, she's taken Mercy. If she takes Northwell next, our oncology division will collapse." Delilah appeared in the doorway. "Then maybe it's time to secure our future. Permanently. The board wants us married by spring. That locks your assets under protection and dissolves spousal claims, Nolan added. And you'll control majority voting. Rights. It's time, Conrad. He nodded numbly. Set the date, but I want to meet her first. Face to face. Maureen received the invitation in early March. Hand-delivered. No return address. A single sentence. Dinner. For closure. She recognized the handwriting immediately. Helena raised an eyebrow. You're not seriously considering it. Maureen turned the note over, silent. Closure, she repeated. Is that what he thinks this is? She tucked the card into a drawer. He'll have to wait. Because at that moment, her focus wasn't on revenge or unfinished conversations. It was on finalizing the next trial phase and preparing Nova Orchid's internal safety summit. But fate had its own timetable. 3 weeks later, Helena burst into the lab, newspaper in hand. On the cover, Conrad Blake and Delilah Crest smiling at a gala, the headline reading, Spring Wedding of the Year, announced for Pharma. Power couple. Maureen stared at the image, her expression calm. May 15th, she murmured. Of course, the anniversary of the day I was erased. Helena leaned against the table. You okay? Maureen stood slowly. They chose that date as a victory lap, but they don't realize what they've done. Her voice was quiet, razor sharp. They've given me the stage. She turned to her laptop and opened a folder marked Contingency. It's time to speak, she said, but not with words. Let's prepare for Valmora. The estate of Valmora had never looked so immaculate. Crisp white roses adorned the iron gates, and gold-trimmed invitations had been sent to over 400 of the most powerful names in pharmaceuticals, politics, and elite society. The media called it the merger of the year, the symbolic uniting of two dynasties, the Blakes and the Crests. The guests arrived in designer gowns and tailored tuxedos, champagne flutes in hand, unaware that the carefully manicured illusion was already beginning to crack. Conrad stood at the altar, wearing a ceremonial smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Delilah was radiant in a gown rumored to cost more than some houses, her hair cascading in vintage waves, her arm looped through her brother Nolan's as they prepared to make their final entrance. But Conrad's gaze drifted toward the horizon. He hadn't slept in days. The image of Maureen's eyes from that photo, sharp, knowing, defiant, had haunted him. He couldn't explain the unease coiling in his stomach. Everything's perfect, Delilah whispered to him moments before the music began. He nodded, but said nothing. And then, right on cue, the heavens answered with a thunderous whoomp, whoomp, whoomp as the sound of an approaching helicopter broke through the string quartet's performance. Panic wasn't immediate. At first, there was confusion. Guests shaded their eyes against the midday sun, some assuming it was a dramatic flourish, perhaps orchestrated by the ever-grand Delilah. But Conrad knew. The moment the aircraft came into view, his face drained of color. He turned to Nolan, who was already moving toward the security detail with a strained expression. "Stop that thing," he barked into a headset. But it was too late. The helicopter descended onto the estate's lawn with precision, wind, whipping through the floral arrangements and sending tablecloths flapping. From within emerged a woman in a tailored charcoal suit, her posture elegant, her face composed. Maureen Vale. Behind her, 2 children stepped out, each holding her hand. Twins, no older than 6, dressed in pale blue and ivory. The crowd began to murmur. Cameras turned. Gasps echoed. "That's her," someone whispered. "That's the ex-wife." But it was the children who stole the breath from the room. Their resemblance to Conrad was uncanny. His eyes, his mouth, even the tilt of their chins. Delilah's grip on her bouquet tightened, her nails digging into her palm. "What is this?" she hissed. "A publicity stunt?" But Maureen's voice rang out, calm and commanding. "No, Delilah. This is the truth interrupting your fantasy." Maureen walked forward with poise, the twins flanking her like quiet sentinels. As she approached the altar, the minister stepped back instinctively, sensing the shift in energy. "Conrad," she said, her voice steady, "you once told me that truth mattered more than appearances. I held on to that long after you stopped believing it." Conrad opened his mouth but said nothing. Children looked up at him, wide-eyed, unblinking. "These are your children," Maureen continued. "Leora and Cassian, 6 years old, conceived in love, born in silence, raised in exile. Delilah turned to Nolan, furious. You said she disappeared. Maureen held up a small folder. DNA tests, birth, certificates, prenatal records, all verified. She handed them to Conrad. And while you're processing that, she added, lifting a second envelope, here are copies of falsified clinical trials, offshore accounts in Crest Holdings' name, and a full report from an independent auditor detailing manipulation of FDA-submitted data. Gasps turned into shouts. Phones came out. The whispers became a roar. A suited man stepped forward from the crowd, flashing a badge. Nolan Crest, Delilah Crest, you are under investigation for wire fraud, document forgery, and endangering public health. You are hereby detained under federal jurisdiction. The scene collapsed into chaos. Delilah shrieked, lunging toward Maureen, but was held back by agents. You ruined everything, she screamed. This was supposed to be my legacy. Nolan tried to run, briefly, but was tackled within seconds by 2 federal officers. Guests backed away, some recording, others shielding their faces. Conrad stood frozen, the documents in his hands trembling. This can't be, he muttered. This can't be real. Maureen turned to him, voice softer now. It's very real, Conrad. You believed lies because they were easier. You handed me to wolves and called it justice. Tears welled in her eyes but didn't fall. But I didn't come for revenge. I came to free myself from the silence, to show our children that truth has a voice. She knelt, holding Leora and Cassian close. See that man? She whispered to them. That's your father. Conrad's knees buckled as he dropped to the grass, eyes locked on the twins. I didn't know, he said, voice cracking. I didn't know. Maureen looked at him for a long moment. You didn't ask. And then she turned, walking toward the helicopter, as agents led the screaming Crest. Siblings away in handcuffs. The aftermath rippled through every corner of the empire they had tried to build. Sinclair Biosolutions stock plummeted within hours. The board issued a statement of shock and immediate internal review. Hospitals began canceling contracts, some announcing new partnerships with Nova Orchid labs within days. The media spun the story into a spectacle, the woman who brought down a dynasty. But Maureen refused all interviews. She returned quietly to her home with the children, protected by anonymity and insulated by purpose. Helena updated her every evening on the company's progress. They're calling you the ghost CEO, she said one night, amused. You've become a legend. Maureen only smiled faintly. Legends fade, but data stays. She enrolled the twins in a small private school under her maiden name. They thrived, bright, inquisitive, loved. At night, she told them stories not of betrayal, but of resilience, of how people can lose everything and still rise. Conrad sent letters, dozens, some begging, others apologizing. She read each one, then filed them away. The past had spoken. She had listened, but she would not relive it. And yet, there were moments when the children laughed in a certain way, or when the sun hit the kitchen window just right, where she allowed herself to feel something gentler, not regret, not bitterness, something close to peace. She sat on the porch one evening, sipping tea while Helena scrolled through the latest board reshuffles at Sinclair. He stepped down, Helena said, effective immediately. Maureen nodded. It was inevitable. Helena looked at her. He still wants to see them. Maureen said nothing. She stared into the distance, the vineyard now silent under twilight. Maybe one day, she said at last. When they ask, when they're ready. Helena nodded, understanding. You were right to come back, she said softly. Maureen breathed deeply. I didn't come back to destroy him. I came back to reclaim myself. The wind stirred the vines. Somewhere in the house, Leora laughed, and Maureen, Vale, once exiled, once silenced, smiled not in triumph but in quiet triumphance, knowing her voice had reshaped a legacy. The fall of Sinclair Biosolutions was not sudden. It was seismic, slow and thunderous, like the collapse of a once majestic cathedral. It began with board members jumping ship, some issuing public apologies, others selling their shares in quiet panic. Investors demanded explanations that no one could offer without incriminating themselves. Federal regulators opened audits that uncovered layers of deception, ghost studies, forged trial results, and a paper trail that stretched across multiple continents and offshore accounts. The pharmaceutical industry, once deferential to the Sinclair name, turned its back in self-preservation. Former allies of Nolan and Delilah came forward, seeking leniency in exchange for testimony. Hospitals began defaulting to Nova Orchid protocols. Doctors rewrote their treatment regimens. Patients and advocacy groups rallied behind Maureen Veil, whose face, though absent from the media, had become a symbol of integrity. Inside the executive offices, Conrad sat alone, watching the company's value crumble in real time. His title as CEO had been revoked by a unanimous vote. His access card no longer worked. The company he was born into had expelled him as easily as it once did Maureen. And yet, amid the ruin, one name kept resurfacing as a possible savior. Hers. It was Helena who first floated the idea. "Merge the companies," she said bluntly over tea in Maureen's kitchen. "We maintain control, but absorb their infrastructure. Save what's salvageable. Protect the supply chain. Patients won't suffer, and we dictate the terms." Maureen stared at her in silence. "You want me to rescue the same institution that erased me?" Helena didn't flinch. "No, I want you to remake it in your image." The proposal wasn't emotional, it was strategic. If Sinclair collapsed entirely, thousands of employees would lose jobs, patients would lose access to medications, and chaos would ripple through already strained healthcare systems. A merger would give Nova Orchid the power to enforce transparency from within and extend their reach globally. Maureen considered it for 3 days. On the 4th, she drafted the merger terms herself. Nova Orchid Labs would acquire majority control, restructure Sinclair under its ethics charter, and Maureen Veil would be named Chief Scientific Officer, with veto power on all research operations. The offer was sent to the interim Sinclair board without fanfare. What followed was a flurry of shocked emails, emergency meetings, and stunned silence. No one had expected the woman they vilified to extend a hand, in victory no less. The board gathered in a sterile, glass-paneled room atop what remained of Sinclair's Manhattan headquarters. Executives shuffled documents, some pale-faced, others visibly sweating. When the terms were read aloud, there was disbelief, then reluctant awe. "She's offering a lifeline," one member said. "And she's not asking for reparations." Another muttered, "She doesn't need money. She already has power." The chairman, an aging executive named Wexler, tapped the table slowly. "You all realize who Maureen Veil is, don't you?" A murmur followed. "She was Maureen Sinclair," he clarified. "Blake's ex-wife, the one we voted to remove 6 years ago." The silence turned leaden. "She's not just our competitor, she's our ghost." After hours of deliberation, they signed. The deal was made public 2 days later. Headlines exploded. Rival firm rescues Sinclair in historic merger. Ex-wife of pharma heir takes the helm. Maureen refused all interview requests. Instead, she issued a single statement through the Nova Orchid website. "This is not about revenge, it's about repair." The signature at the bottom read simply, "Dr. Maureen Veil, Ph.D." Meanwhile, Conrad was left to navigate the ruins of both his company and his legacy. He had moved into a modest brownstone in the West Village, far from the penthouse he once shared with Delilah. The silence in the house was different from the one he'd lived with after Maureen's exile. It wasn't heavy with guilt, but hollow with consequence. He spent his days reviewing reports on clinical outcomes and researching the Veil protocol, attempting to understand how the woman he abandoned had accomplished what generations of his family never had. But he was no longer seeking redemption through business. He wanted something more human, something painfully overdue. It took him 2 weeks to build the courage, but eventually he handwrote a letter to Maureen. "I don't deserve your forgiveness," it began, "but I would like to know my children." He didn't expect an answer. When a courier returned with a small envelope 3 days later, his hands trembled. Inside was a note, brief but unmistakable. "Leora and Cassian have questions. They're old enough now to ask them. I won't stand in their way, but I won't lead them to you either. If you want to know them, start by earning their trust." It wasn't a door. It was a crack in the wall. Their first meeting took place in a neutral space, a small botanical garden Maureen often brought the twins to during spring weekends. She watched from a bench nearby, invisible among the trees, while Conrad knelt by the koi pond as Cassian approached cautiously. "I like your watch," the boy said. "Is it real gold?" Conrad smiled gently. "No, just polished steel, but it was a gift. From my grandfather. He told me time is something you should always respect." Cassian nodded solemnly, then ran off to chase a butterfly. Leora remained more guarded. "Are you going to lie to us?" she asked bluntly. Conrad blinked. "No," he said honestly. "I've done enough of that already." She tilted her head. "Mama says lies make people sick on the inside." "She's right," he replied. "That sickness cost me everything." For a long moment, Leora studied him, then offered him a single flower, a marigold she had picked near the gate. "You can come again," she said, "but only if you bring real stories." Maureen watched all of it with quiet detachment. She wasn't ready to share her heart, but she could share their laughter, and that, for now, was enough. In the months that followed, the world adjusted to the new order. Nova Orchid Sinclair became a global benchmark in ethical pharmaceutical development. Clinical trial reforms were implemented across all divisions. Former whistleblowers were hired into leadership roles. Transparency became policy, not propaganda. Maureen traveled occasionally, never for conferences, only to inspect facilities or to personally approve experimental protocols. Her presence was rare but reverent. She still refused interviews, though her face now graced medical journals, university walls, and the quiet gratitude of families who no longer had to choose between treatment and survival. Helena remained at her side, co-director and friend. And Conrad? He came often, not to seek Maureen, but to sit with Leora and Cassian, who began asking him harder questions. He answered honestly, never painting himself as a hero. In doing so, he found a version of fatherhood that wasn't performative, but redemptive. One night, as Maureen sat in her study, watching the children sleep through a baby monitor, Helena entered with a glass of wine. "They like him," she said. Maureen nodded. "He's trying." Helena raised her glass. "To shattered thrones." Maureen clinked hers gently. "And those who learn to build again, not just rule." And together, they drank to a new empire, one built not on legacy, but on choice. 1 year had passed since the merger that rewrote the narrative of modern medicine. Nova Orchid Sinclair was no longer just a company. It had become a movement. Medical institutions across 5 continents cited it as the new standard for transparency, accessibility, and ethical responsibility. In former boardrooms now transformed into open science councils, researchers collaborated without fear of political reprisal or budgetary sabotage. The Veil Protocol had expanded its application to pediatric oncology, with survival rates climbing and long-term effects drastically reduced. Maureen had signed off on each adaptation personally, insisting on oversight not from distrust, but from care. Meanwhile, the company's ethos spread beyond treatment. New initiatives addressed rural health education, equitable drug distribution, and community-run clinical trials. The name Veil was now associated not with scandal or vengeance, but with resilience, vision, and rebirth. Yet Maureen remained largely unseen by the public. She preferred her garden in the countryside, early mornings with a mug of black coffee, and the sound of her children's footsteps bounding through dew-covered grass. The power she once feared now lived in her quietly, not as armor, but as foundation. The empire had been rebuilt, not atop others' ruins, but from seeds planted in truth. Conrad, once the figurehead of a fractured dynasty, had transformed in quieter but no less profound ways. No longer a CEO or a man, or of suits and cold marble offices, he had embraced a role far more daunting, that of an attentive, accountable father. At first, the twins approached him with cautious curiosity, asking him the kinds of questions that cut deeper than any boardroom confrontation. Why didn't you believe her? Did you ever love her? Were you scared of the truth? He answered them all, not with rehearsed regret, but with honesty, stripped of pride. Slowly, they began to let him in. He drove them to piano recitals, listened to their dreams about the ocean and space, and learned how to braid Leora's hair, albeit imperfectly. The man who once orchestrated silence had learned to sit in it, to let his children fill the spaces he no longer needed to control. He and Maureen maintained a respectful distance, exchanging updates through shared calendars and the occasional handwritten note about schedules or school. Meetings. They weren't friends, not quite, but they were no longer enemies. They were something else entirely. Co-parents forged in fire, now tempered by grace. Maureen's heart, once a guarded vault, began to beat in unfamiliar rhythms again. Slow, curious, hesitant. It started with small exchanges. During the twins' medical checkups, Dr. Adrian Kerr was their new pediatrician. Gentle-voiced, bright-eyed, with a penchant for classical piano and an almost old-fashioned kindness that felt out of place in modern cynicism. He asked thoughtful questions, not just about the children's health, but about their minds, their stories. He never pushed, never flirted, but Maureen noticed the way he spoke to her, not to her resume, not to her headlines, but to herself. Their conversations spilled over from clinical notes to weekend coffees, and from coffees to late walks under quiet stars. Adrian didn't offer rescue or replacement. He brought patience, space, safety. The first time he kissed her, it was in her kitchen, as the twins slept in the next room and jazz hummed from an old record player. It wasn't cinematic. It was real, grounded, and Maureen, stunned by the simplicity of it, let herself lean in. She wasn't searching for what she lost. She was discovering what she never knew she could have. Love, not as possession or promise, but as presence. The twins' 8th birthday arrived on a clear April morning, and Maureen insisted on doing something different. No bounce houses this year, she told them. No magicians. We're going to celebrate with stories. The theme was Explorers of Tomorrow, a tribute to curiosity, wonder, and the courage to imagine. The garden was transformed with handmade decorations, paper rockets, maps of fantastical lands, and a storytelling circle. Beneath a tree, Maureen had planted the year they were born. Friends from school arrived dressed as astronauts, inventors, and time travelers. Conrad brought a telescope and helped the children find constellations. Adrian cooked homemade pizza with Leora, who declared him better than any chef on TV. Helena arrived late, as usual, carrying a telescope lens she swore was purely for scientific integrity. Maureen watched from a few feet away, camera in hand, heart full. There was laughter, shared glances, a rhythm of joy that didn't feel forced or borrowed. It was theirs. At sunset, the children gathered for a photo, flanked by the adults who had shaped them. A father finding his way, a mother who had rebuilt herself, a healer with gentle hands, and a friend who never stopped believing in rebels. A click, a flash, a memory made permanent. Later that night, as the house quieted and the twins fell asleep in a pile of birthday balloons and crumpled gift wrap, Maureen stepped onto the porch with Adrian. They didn't speak for a long while. The sky above was clean and star-filled, and the breeze carried the scent of earth and celebration. "Did you ever think we'd get here?" Adrian finally asked. Maureen exhaled. "No. Not like this. Not with this much peace." He touched her hand, tentative but steady. "You earned it." She nodded. "Maybe, but I didn't do it alone." He smiled. "No one ever does." Inside, the photograph now sat framed on the mantel. Leora grinning with missing teeth, Cassian mid-laugh, Conrad holding the telescope, Helena giving bunny ears, Adrian and Maureen with their shoulders touching just enough. It wasn't a perfect picture, but it was honest. And that made it perfect in its own right. Maureen turned to Adrian. "We didn't just rebuild a company," she said. "We rebuilt a story." He looked at her, eyes warm. "And what do you call this chapter?" She leaned her head on his shoulder. "New roots." And so, what had once been ashes became soil. What had once been silence became music. In the place where Maureen was discarded, she bloomed. Not for approval, not for revenge, but because she could. Because she must, and because now, finally, she knew how. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe to Mr. Edward's Tales for more powerful narratives like this one. Leave a like, share your thoughts in the comments, and send this video to someone who would love to experience this journey. Your support keeps these tales alive.